Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee, here to wish you a happy Morrissey Monday, my weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths. And for this week's episode, I thought I would give you a little bit of the backstory into my fandom, how I discovered the music of Morrissey, and the album which is responsible for turning this once respectable young man into the sad and pathetic fanboy you see sitting before you today. A little bit before, going back in time a little bit before my Morrissey fandom, even as a little kid, I was never a casual music fan. I was relatively lucky in my house as a young kid. My parents got VH1 and MTV when I was still relatively young, and almost immediately I became completely obsessed with it. I was just captivated by the music and the imagery and the exotic people. I grew up in a very small town in the mountains of Northern California, and the things that I got exposed to on MTV were so far away from the reality of my daily life that it just really was something that I became obsessed with at quite a young age. I would say my first musical obsession as a little kid was probably like a lot of people my age. The first music artist I became very, very obsessed with was Weird Al Yankovic. And as a little kid, I just became obsessed with him. I collected a whole stack of all of his cassettes. I would annoy anybody who would listen to me about his greatness. I remember my parents used to have parties quite a bit when I was a little kid, and I would come out of my room and I'd annoy their friends with my little stack of Weird Al tapes. And my parents' friends were always quite polite about it, at least outwardly. In their head, they were probably just like, "Man, get this kid away from me." But I would say it was up until about middle school that was my first music obsession. I remember in 7th grade, as I began middle school, I took a music appreciation class. And I remember there was a day where there was a project where each student could bring in an album that they really liked and play a song in front of the class, explain why you liked the song, explain what it meant to you. And I think sadly, even though I was in 7th grade at this point, I still might have brought in a Weird Al tape the first time I ever did that. But it was in that class, one of my fellow students brought in a copy. I think it was still new at the time. But one of my students brought in a copy of Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. And I remember as a young 7th grader, I had never heard anything like that. That was definitely not really the type of music that my parents listened to, and I don't think it was quite the MTV staple that it was going to become yet. And I just remember it really blew me away. And for a couple years after that, I became a big fan. That was probably my first introduction into quote-unquote real music. And I would say for the couple years that I was in middle school, I became a huge fan of that kind of music. I was a big Guns N' Roses fan. I love stuff like Metallica, Rat, Warrant, Poison, Dokken. Dokken. Man, that band sucks. Oh my God. But after a couple years of listening to that kind of music, it began to feel to me like a shirt that was 2 sizes too small. It just didn't feel like it fit me. It didn't really represent who I was. And probably not coincidentally, around the same time, if you were paying attention to MTV like I was religiously, you began to see and hear a new wave of bands as the alternative revolution was beginning. This was the kind of music and bands that I had never seen or heard of before. Like I said, I grew up in a very small town. There were definitely not underground alternative or punk rock shows happening in my hometown. The biggest trouble you could find in my hometown was bingo night at the Baptist church. So when I first started discovering these bands on MTV, of course I remember, like a lot of people do, I probably remember where I was the first time I saw the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. And of course, like a lot of people my age, that video just opened up a whole new world to me, a whole world that I had no idea even existed. And pretty much immediately I became very curious about that kind of what I thought at the time was underground music. I know once it's on MTV, it's no longer underground. I know that now, but at the time, I still thought it was very underground. Around the same time, I started high school. Now, I think I told you I grew up in a very small town. My high school was very stereotypical. The student body was basically cut into like the basic food groups. You had the jocks, the cool kids, the cheerleaders, the stoners, the nerds. And me and my one friend didn't really fit into any of those categories, so we were kind of loners. I definitely think we were two of the weird kids in our school. Fortunately, I think for us, at least fortunately for us, we were never really targeted. I think actually some of the kids in our school were kind of scared of us or didn't quite know what to make of us. But that was just fine with me. I wasn't particularly interested in too many of my fellow students. I had grown up in that town my whole life. That's the kind of town where the same people you're friends with the first day of kindergarten, you're friends with the last day of 12th grade. And I didn't have any friends the first day of kindergarten, so I knew I probably wasn't going to really have any friends by the end of 12th grade. And like I said, it was also a town I just wasn't invested in. I knew I was going to get out someday. That was the type of town. My hometown was the kind of place where either when you graduate from high school, and yes, I graduated from high school, but this kind of place when you graduate from high school, you either leave the next day or you stay there forever. And I had no intention of ever staying. I knew that even as a young kid. I was never going to stay in that town. So I wasn't particularly invested. So music just became more and more important to me. It was around the same time my best friend and I discovered comic books. Now this was before the days now when Marvel is the coolest thing in the world. Back then, comic books were kind of social repellent. If there was anything you could do in my high school to make girls sick, I ruled at it. But comic books and music became very important to me. They were, like I said, they were an escape. They kind of served as reward for me coming home after the long day of school. I get to listen to music or read comic books and escape my daily life of being in high school I didn't like with a bunch of people I couldn't relate to. And music just has always became more and more important to me, and to this day is still probably the most important thing in my life. I can't imagine anything ever being more important to me than music. Fast forward now to 12th grade. Second half of 12th grade was a very difficult time for me. Not because I was sad about school ending. Trust me, I couldn't wait. There was one bright side of my life at that point in time. It was that high school, the light at the end of the tunnel for high school was quickly approaching, thank God. But the second half of 12th grade was a particularly difficult time for me. I think I told you that I had one friend basically from 7th grade through 12th grade. And about halfway through 12th grade, he and I ended up having a big falling out. I'm not quite sure what it was about anymore. It was a long time ago. So I was pretty much left alone the last half of high school, or the last half of 12th grade, I should say. And I just kind of ended up feeling like a rudderless ship, just drifting through life. And it was at that time that music and comic books became even more and more important to me. And maybe I got a little bit weird. I'm not going to lie about that. But it was towards the end of 12th grade. I was in my government class, and my teacher announced to us one day that we were going to be taking a field trip down to our state capital in Sacramento. Now, the town I grew up in California is a couple hours north of Sacramento, up in the mountains. And he told us the day before the trip that we needed to find a travel partner for the trip. We were going to be taking a bus down to Sacramento, and we had to find a travel partner to travel with that day and somebody to hang out with. And I was immediately uncomfortable because I didn't really talk to anybody in my school, especially after my friend and I had kind of like parted ways. But there was one other kid in my 12th grade government class. I was a band shirt kid. Still am. But there was one other kid in my government class who also wore band shirts. And to this day, I can't remember his name, and I'm not saying that to be a dick or anything. I just really can't remember his name. It was a long time ago. He and I weren't friends. Like I said, I wasn't really friends with anybody in high school too much. But he and I decided that we would be travel partners because we both wore band shirts. And so we were talking, and he told me, he's like, hey man, why don't you bring some CDs tomorrow? I'll bring some CDs tomorrow. We can kind of switch and trade or whatever. I was like, cool. Like, CDs and my Discman. I'm sure those of you old enough to remember your Discmans. My Discman was like my best friend. I mean, I took that thing everywhere. So the next day we show up to class. I got my Discman. I got a stack of CDs. He has the same. We get on the bus and we are heading down to Sacramento to sit in on a session of the California State Assembly. We also got to meet our assemblymen, have lunch with them. Why am I telling you that? Do you care? No. Anyway, his name is Bernie Richter, just in case you're curious. Anyway, so we get on the road, and I'm sitting next to this dude who I don't really know very well. And I'm just kind of listening to music, and he's listening to music. And he pulls a CD out of his bag, and he says, hey man, you got to listen to this. Have you heard this? And he held up a copy of Morrissey's BONA DRAG. And I remember at the time, I kind of knew who Morrissey was, and I knew that he had been the singer of the Smiths. But at the time, for some reason, I wasn't particularly interested. Like I said, I was more into music at this time, like Butthole Surfers, Rollins Band, Dead Milkmen. And I always thought, I kind of had this preconceived idea at the time that I didn't particularly like Morrissey, although I didn't know anything about him. I just thought it was music that I wasn't into because the music I was into was way too cool. And I was like, nah, man, I'm cool. I don't really want to listen to that. And I remember he looked at me and was like, why? And I remember I could not come up with a good answer. I was just sitting there like, I don't know. And he's like, no, man, you got to listen to this album. So I sort of like begrudgingly like snagged it from him. I was like, all right, fine, I'll listen to it. And so I popped this thing into my Discman, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you within the first few notes of the very first song, Piccadilly Polari, I could visibly see my life changing. And I probably listened to this album probably 4 times that day. I can assure you he probably didn't get the CD back until the very end of the day, at which time I probably gave it back to him begrudgingly. But this thing, the first time I heard BONA DRAG was literally, and I know I say this term a lot and it probably loses its meaning after a while, but this thing was literally a life changer. I mean, my life ended when I started playing it and my new life began. Not saying my new life is any better, but it was definitely a life changer. Like I said, I listened to it probably 4 or 5 times that day. And as soon as I got to the end, I started it back over. I remember I gave the CD back to him at the end of the day. I went home. And this is kind of how much of a loser I am, or was at least. I went home and I actually remember walking around my house and sitting in my room listening. And I remember thinking about this album. Just obsessing over it. And at my next earliest possible convenience, I went out and I bought my own copy of it. And in the years since, I've proceeded to probably wear out 4 or 5 copies of this album. Now, I'm not usually the most spiritual person in the world, but sometimes I think that the timing and the point in my life when this album was introduced to me was not coincidental. Sometimes I think that the world hands you things to help you get through a hard time, or gives you tools to help you get through life. And like I said, at the time when I first heard this album was a very dark time for me. I was just trying to eke my way through the end of high school. I literally had 0 friends. And I think that this was the universe. And again, this is going to get really like maybe out there. Maybe it was not. Maybe it was just my classmate going, here, listen to this, so I don't have to talk to this weird kid sitting next to me. But I can't help but think that this was, in some ways, a gift from the universe. At the time, I just felt so alone and so lost. And I remember sometimes I think that this was the world saying, look, kid, you're not. There's somebody else that you can listen to this record and get through it. And this album just gave me like immediate hope. And again, I know that sounds really hokey. And my relationship with Morrissey since then, like I said, is going on 30 years strong. And to me, there's just never been an artist. First off, there's never been a band as good as the Smiths. Just one. They're the greatest band of all time. There's never been a band that sounded like the Smiths. There's never been a singer that sounded like Morrissey. And there's just never been anybody who writes the type of songs that he writes. And just for me, on like a personal note, and I'm not trying to get overly sappy here, but for me on a personal note, there's just never been an artist of any genre or any other style of music that I just relate to on the level that I relate to with Morrissey. And I think sometimes that's why it kind of makes me laugh. I talked about this on one of my earlier videos when I did my Morrissey ranking about the attempt by certain people to kind of cancel Morrissey. Those people whose lives are so easy that the worst thing that could ever happen to them is they hear something that they disagree with. Because the relationship, at least with me, and I can only speak for myself, but the relationship I have with this artist and this album in particular, I don't think anything could really ever come between that. And somebody asked me one time, what would you ever say if you met Morrissey? Would you ever want to meet Morrissey? I should not meet Morrissey. I would embarrass myself pretty quickly. But if I ever had an opportunity to meet Morrissey or just have a brief conversation with him, I would just say thank you. Honestly, thank you. As soon as I got this album, I went out and I began collecting a lot of his everything is in his previous catalog up to that point, and I've been a fan ever since. Since 1994, when I became a fan, there's been a million bands I've fallen in and out of love with. I've gone through a lot of different kind of musical phases. But Morrissey and this album have always been by my side. And to me, this is the greatest album of all time. And to me, it's maybe more of a sentimental thing than it is anything else. Although I do think that every album or every song on this album is absolutely perfect. There isn't a bad song on this entire album. And I have the CD, and I also have the vinyl that came out in 2010. This is the 2010 reissue, remastered. I love it. Beautiful. I do not have an original pressing on vinyl. Not too happy about that. But maybe someday. It's a bucket list thing. Anyway, this album came out October 15th, 1990. And I know, again, it is a compilation. You don't have to tell me that. This album was produced by Stephen Street, Clive Langer, and Alan Winstanley. And this is my favorite album of all time. Bar none. Favorite artist of all time, favorite album of all time. And I always tell people, when the time comes for me to enter into the big dirt nap, I don't really care what you do with my body. Doesn't matter to me, but just make sure that there's a copy of this thing close by, or I'm going to come looking for you. Anyway, this album begins with the song Piccadilly Polari. I absolutely love that song. Of course, that song features Suggs from Madness on backing vocals. On the 2010 reissue, there is the Piccadilly Polari. There's an extended verse in the 2010 version, which is okay. I actually prefer just the original version. Love that song. I mean, it's going to get repetitive, but I think that this is the greatest album of all time. Next song is Interesting Drug. Love it. Great. Perfect. Kirsty MacColl. I hate to say Fairy Tale of New York fame, even though it's a great song, but Kirsty MacColl of Fairy Tale of New York fame does backing vocals on this song. I absolutely love it. The next song is November Spawned a Monster. This song features Mary O'Hara on backing vocals. And I will say I love the song November Spawned a Monster. But I will say that of all of Morrissey's videos, it's probably maybe my least favorite. It's a little cringe sometimes, I'm not going to lie to you. There's actually a funny clip on YouTube of Henry Rollins. I believe he was hosting 120 Minutes, which, by the way, 120 Minutes when I was in high school on Sunday nights, man, that was like my jam. That's how I got turned on to so many bands that way. But anyway, there's a funny clip on YouTube of Henry Rollins. I believe he's hosting 120 Minutes, but he introduces the video for November Spawned a Monster. And I don't think that Hank is a big fan of Morrissey. Just gonna say, because he slams him pretty hard. And honestly, I love that song, November Spawned a Monster. It is one of my favorite songs off this record. But the video is a little much. Anyway, next song is We'll Never Marry. I absolutely love that song. Some people say it's a sad song. I don't know if that, I mean, they're all sad songs, I guess. I don't know if that song's overly sad or not. I love that song. Such a Little Thing makes a big difference. Again, I think that this album, every second of it is perfect. This is the greatest album of all time. You could say the word compilation till your face falls off. I really don't give a good goddamn. Favorite album of all time. Last of the International Famous Playboys. I just love that song. Ouija Board. Again, it's going to get repetitive. I just think that this is just perfection. Hairdresser on Fire. And then my favorite song of all time, which is also off Viva Hate, is Every Day is Like Sunday. That is probably my all-time favorite song. I know it's definitely not like a deep cut. It's not like some obscure B-side or anything. But I really love that song. It's just probably my favorite song of all time. I have this thing where I don't know why, but I've always kind of hated working on Sundays. I always have worked Sundays because of the industry that I work in. So every day I wake up on Sunday and I hate working on Sundays. That's the first song I play, is Every Day is Like Sunday. I know it's real dumb. Anyway, He Knows I'd Love to See Him is amazing. I absolutely love that song. Yes, I Am Blind. Lucky Lisp is one of my favorite songs off this album. Of course, Suede Head is also on this album, which of course is also on Viva Hate. You know, a lot of these songs are singles and B-sides from that same era. Obviously, you already know that. But Suede Head is awesome. I've always said it, you know, Suede Head is maybe the ultimate non-deep track from Morrissey, at least Morrissey's solo career. But you have to love it. If you say that you don't like Suede Head, you're just being the guy who says that on purpose. I know it. I got you figured out, man. And of course, this album ends with the song Disappointed, which never leaves me disappointed. But anyway, this was the album BONA DRAG, which corrupted my mind and body. I think that this is the greatest record of all time. Like I said, I technically know that it's a compilation, but I technically don't really care what you think. Anyway, thanks a lot for checking out this video. A little deep dive into my early fandom of Morrissey and my all-time favorite album. If you enjoyed this, I feel sorry for you. But if you did, check back every week, every Monday for Morrissey Monday, celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths. Remember to support your local record store, which I'm going to go do probably right now. And listen to BONA DRAG or anything in the Morrissey catalog. Anyway, thanks again for checking out this video. My name is Jamie. This is Archaic Records. And we'll talk to you next time.